really the degree to which we see a lot of different perspectives agreeing on the scope of the problem. I look at the different perspectives that are speaking in this film, and I think that stepping back, there's that broad consensus that I think really has developed and has crystallized around climate change and forestry being one of the central challenges that we all as professionals are going to face throughout the remainder of our careers. So at this point, I'd like to invite Adrian Prado from Northern Hardwood Research Institute to take the stage. Adrian was involved in the production and filming of this piece. Adrian, I guess I invite you to come up for comment and talk a little bit about the experience of making that film and what you want people to take from it, and maybe where it's going next.
Hi for me. All right, so yeah, I'm Adrian. I guess I'll give you a little bit of context on how we got started in filmmaking at NHRI. It doesn't really seem like it fits, but it does. So I started about a little bit less than a year ago, working part-time, and in the spring, Gaetan invited me to his office and said, I really want to share information about climate change to our stakeholders, to the forestry community. Guides are really useful, but maybe people might not read it, so we really need to find a way to package this. And I said, well, maybe we could make a documentary. And Gaetan was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. So I was like, I know people, and so this is what happened. So it was pretty quick. We got this done in really a few months. And the idea is really to give, as Chris was saying, a broad perspective and package the information that we do have on climate change to kind of sensitize different groups on these issues. There's a lot that we don't know about climate change, about the impacts, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it during the panel and during some of the subsequent presentations, but there is a lot that we do know. And I think just knowing that there's a lot of things that we don't know is actually important also. We know that things are going to be changing quite substantially. How exactly, that's still an unknown, but we need to be prepared for that and start thinking about adaptation and adaptive silviculture in that context. So the filmmakers who are involved with this, as I mentioned, I knew them before, it's Mathieu Germain and Tanguy Lequeneux. So they're actually two students that I met in Rivière-du-Loup, not too far from here, and so they completed a film course there, and they were more than happy enough to explore this opportunity. It's their ambition to start working on nature documentaries, so this was a really good first step. And I think they really produced something that's hopefully going to be valuable not just to us at NHRI, but to all of you. And hopefully it can be a good way to communicate with your own stakeholders and talk about the issues surrounding climate change. And you can share this easily packaged information through social media and online. So that's pretty much it. But if you have any questions, and once again, thank you for everyone who was involved in being filmed and allowed us to film you. I know it's not always easy, especially if we don't have experience being filmed, but I think everyone did an amazing job and we really got this cohesive message, which is really important.
Do we have any questions from the audience for Adrian? Okay, well, another round of applause.
So the next part of our afternoon session, I'd like to invite 7 panelists to come up and to take a seat, and we're going to explore this subject a little bit more in depth. Again, I've got some questions prepared for the panelists, but you're also, as audience members, going to get a chance to ask questions yourself. So please give that some thought while they come up. And everybody's going to get a chance, first of all, to introduce themselves, and then ask each of the panelists to provide their name, their affiliation, the organization that they're working with, as well as what their own connections to climate change and sustainable forest management are. So that's how we'll get started. So I'll invite all the panelists to come up.
yourself or everyone?
So we've got a really interesting cross section, as I think you're going to come to appreciate. We've got panelists here who are experts in the field of ecological modeling. We have people involved in policy. We have expertise, and we have experience coming from industry and a little bit from government as well. So really a great cross section of the sphere, I guess, of discussion around climate change and forestry. And so, to be fair, I have given the panelists a few questions to think about ahead of time. So we cheated up a little bit with respect to that, but I think that's only fair for asking them to come up here. But as I said, the first thing that I'm going to do is just hand the microphone around and ask each one of you in turn to give yourself a quick 1-minute introduction, let's say, and give the audience a feel for what type of perspective and experience you're bringing.
Thank you. Oh. Oh, yes.
Backup plan.
I like to give feedback, but not this one. Okay, my name is Charles Portis. I'm a forest research scientist at the Canadian Wood Fibre Center in Quebec City. And I'm rather new in the question about adaptation to climate change. I'm really interested into, once we have ideas of what's going on, what should we do with that on the silviculture aspect? And we're just scratching the surface right now. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I'm Greg Adams with J&E Irving Limited. Over my career, I've been involved in a lot of aspects of silviculture, including our tree improvement program, all aspects of silviculture in the woods, nursery production, things like that. And all aspects of silviculture is a long-term venture, and so really been paying attention to adaptation and building resilience pretty much for the last 20 years. I've been considering those things and how we build that into the work that we do.
Thanks, Greg. My name is Anthony Taylor, federal government scientist in forest ecology. I work for the Canadian Forest Service in Fredericton, New Brunswick. My research background is studying predicting the effect of climate change on the forest of Canada, but more specifically the forest of the Maritimes. Over the past 5 years, I've worked a lot in this area and published a number of papers specifically on this topic. The climate of New Brunswick has warmed significantly since the 1970s, and it's very likely to warm by another 2 degrees by the year 2050. This is something that there's a lot of confidence in. The question is not so much whether the climate will change, but rather how much will it affect us. I think, make no mistake about it, that type of change will affect us in one way or another. It's just how much will that effect be, whether it be a small effect or a big effect. And that's where the uncertainty currently lies, and that's at the heart of our research at the Atlantic Forestry Center.
My name is Louise Kemal, and I've been working on climate change issues for 30 years. From the beginning, I was at the Earth Summit, every international negotiation, federal policy, provincial policy, worked with municipalities in climate change. And after 20-some years of little progress, did my master's and PhD. So I did my PhD at UNB, and my current work is focused on the environmental sociology, the environmental psychology, environmental ethics, environmental communications aspects of climate change. I do a lot of research with environmental groups, but I also have been working with the New Brunswick Federation of Woodland Owners on a climate adaptation project that I'll talk about, as well as with Van Lance and Chris Hennigar and Charles on some research with forest-dependent communities. So we look at the human aspects of adapting to climate change.
Chris Hennigar. I work with the Department of Natural ERD, Energy and Resource Development, as a biometrician. I'm also an honorary research associate at the University of New Brunswick, and I supervise some grad students down there, and I'm kind of this arm's length in the research side of ERD with respect to growth and yield research. So I work a lot with NHRI as well on trying to collaboratively push forward our growth and yield modeling. My background is, growth and yield modeling, but also carbon sequestration modeling and carbon accounting, as well as spruce budworm disturbance modeling. And as of late, over the past 5 or 10 years now, we've been moving more into trying to model climate change. And so we have a few projects, as Louise has mentioned, and another project with Anthony, where we're trying to integrate these climate change adapters on growth and survival in these models. And we're getting closer to that, and we might talk a little bit about that today.
Hello. My name is Charles Portis. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management. The area of expertise is in hydrology, meteorology. So I'm particularly interested in the interface between the atmosphere and the biosphere. So that can be in terms of forests, or it could be other biomes. I work in China quite a bit, so I do work in shrubland. So I have that overall interest in looking at how these flows between the atmosphere and the biosphere, and vice versa. So in terms of, I have a particular interest in landscape development processes, so I try to bring a lot of the understanding point locations of the landscape to looking at what might happen over a complete landscape. So.
Okay, so thank you for each of the panelists for giving that bit of introduction. And I thought that I would start the panel discussion with a bit of a reflection that climate change and particularly forests' role in adaptation and in mitigating climate change has been all over the news in the last couple of years. And it really has become a prevalent part, I believe, of the public dialogue around the issue. I mean, we've seen at a global scale just a week ago a young Swedish teenager scolding world leaders at the UN over the lack of response to climate change. And then we've seen it, I think, more in a local and regional perspective, and particularly around the need for climate change adaptation in natural resource management, and especially in forest management in Atlantic Canada. And so, first thing that I've asked you to discuss or to reflect on is Anthony's talked about some of the impacts that we're already seeing, and I think we talked a little bit about in the video impacts with respect to weather patterns that evolve over the decadal time frame, and then we've also seen impacts that are more acute when it comes to extreme weather. And whether or not your organization has been either directly impacted by some of these changes that we've seen produced as a result of the change in climate, or even indirectly impacted as a result of some of this new public dialogue and public level of interest around climate change. So the first question is really, how has your organization been influenced by that, and what's changed in your organization in recent time?
Well, the most obvious one is in my organization, since 2 summers, there are more people wearing shorts at the office. Okay. No, it's getting warmer. No, the real thing is the Canadian Forest Service has been working on climate change questions since a long time, but there's a greater money and people investment over the last years on these questions. First, we're assessing the impacts like Anthony talked about, and now more about how do we manage forests in that direction. Well, that's how it impacts the climate change. And what's the impact of the Forest Service on that side?
So as far as impacts, again, it's difficult to separate weather from climate, but when you look at, when you talk to people around, certainly it was referenced in the video about the 200-year floods year after year. And I think in general, talking with the folks that work in the woods for a long time, there does seem to be more extreme events happening, and that's manifested itself into increasing culvert sizing, things like that for stream flow, and typically in the range of 20% over what would have been done even 5 years ago. And you get when you ask another point that's brought up quite a lot is the influence of winter harvesting activities, and are you able to access the winter ground? And it depends on who you talk to, but I think overall there's a general feeling that the winter harvesting period is less predictable than it would have been years ago, and that's talking to folks that have been working in harvesting operations for 20, 30 years. So that's I guess those would be the biggest things that we would say today.
It's funny, just on that note with winter harvesting, like I work for the federal government, but I grew up in the forest industry in Nova Scotia. My family has a business there, and just talking to some of the guys who've been working in the woods there for the last 30, 40 years, they notice a big difference. And I see it myself in my short life in terms of the window of opportunity to cut in the wintertime and how drastically that's changed. But I think from the federal government perspective, the biggest change, of course, is the change in climate itself. It's not like an elusive sort of fuzzy thing. There's actual tangible fact-based information to show that climate actually has changed. It's just how is that change in climate now affecting the forest itself? And I'd say from a national level that the biggest thing, the most obvious thing, it would be the effect on fires in Western Canada. We're seeing unprecedented levels of forest fire in British Columbia and Alberta. And when you see those things affect people and communities, that's when, of course, it gets the government's real attention. And so there has been almost a renewal of interest and funding towards climate change research within my organization over the last couple of years since I've been there.
I'd say from the work I do, what's really changed is the social dimension. People are personally experiencing what they perceive to be more extreme events that are affecting their day-to-day life and their quality of life. And it's raising anxiety. So I thought I'd just give you a couple of quick stats in terms of a couple of the research projects we're doing. We did a household survey mail drop in Nakawik, Dopetown, and St. Quentin just weeks ago. And in that survey, we asked a couple of questions that might be of interest to you because they reflect social expectations potentially. We asked people whether they perceived that climate change or extreme events were already affecting forest-related jobs or would affect them in the future. And over half of the respondents said that they see an increase in those things, that they believe forest jobs are being affected and will be affected, with the highest results, well over 60%, 64 and 66% in St. Quentin. So there's something about St. Quentin where the results are quite high. When we asked people whether it was climate change is affecting forests in New Brunswick, not the job side, but the forest side, 64% of people in St. Quentin say yes, and just over 50% in Dopetown and Nakawik. But for the future, 78% say it will. So there's a rising awareness among people that climate change is something that's affecting them in the here and now and where they are. When we ask people how concerned they are, we now have 72% of people in St. Quentin are concerned or very concerned. This means there's an expectation on governments, industries, whether it's your municipal government, your provincial government, your federal government, and of course people are coming home and talking to their kids, or their kids are talking to parents, and so in this survey, another survey I did of all New Brunswickers. I asked, are you experiencing extreme events and is it making you feel anxious? And 58% of New Brunswickers say that climate change is either making them, they strongly agree or agree that climate change is making them anxious. And those kinds of emotions are going to drive higher and higher expectations for a response. So expect more climate strikes and other kinds of activities, I would think.
So speaking from ERD, the provincial government now has a climate secretariat, and within our work plans, we have very clear targets to incorporate climate change into our strategic planning. So for the next forest management plan, we are expected to, in some way, incorporate climate change impacts into that forest management plan. And we're just in the midst of trying to figure out exactly how to do that. In terms of insects, we're seeing more balsam woody adelgid in the south, and how do we incorporate that into our yield forecast? So there's more unknowns than knowns, but we certainly have a strong mandate to deliver on this stuff during the next management plan. So there's still quite a bit to sort out on that.
Well, I guess I view myself more as an observer. And I just need to go to the satellite information that's been collected over the last 20 or so years. And you can actually see the greening occurring in the upper, northern Canada. I just came back from Cape Breton, just at the end of August. And one of the issues that came up when we were talking about various, topics about climate, how animals interact with the land. In fact, what we're seeing is that there's a tendency now for the forest that was there at one time, especially in the plateau, are slowly converting into grasslands. And I was talking to Louise, and she said, yeah, she saw those grasslands. And so that was an interesting point. So, they attributed that to the moose. So they established exposures. And they wanted to see if it was possible to restore those grasslands into what it was prior to the grasslands. They couldn't. So I'm wondering if there's interactions between what the moose has done. Now the moose has declined to a level that's more reasonable. At one time it was like 8,000 moose in Cape Breton Highlands plateau. And now they're at a lower level. So the idea is that there's a lot of things happening. Climate could be an element. It's really to disentangle that information. And sometimes it's not easy. And when we look at the relationship between land use in terms of our activities, and you look at places like Costa Rica, the fact that they're losing cloud forests is related to what's happening upstream from the mountain regions. So there is that connection relating to the meteorology that relates what's happening in the lowlands versus what's happening in the mountains. And that's having a major impact on biodiversity in Costa Rica because of that. So again, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle what is driving what, to really identify what the drivers are. And so that's where I think people need to spend time to really say, well, it's due to climate change or it's due to something else.
Okay, so for my next question, I'm gonna swing and focus a little bit in a question that's related to the working forest. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm sensitive a little bit to the audience and to the history of the Canadian Woodlands Forum. I think Peter did a great job this morning of kind of walking us through the 100-year history and really where this organization has come from. And when I think about a couple of the really big influences that are gonna change the shape of the working forest in the future, I think about things like the fact that there's going to be a global demand for forest products that does not seem to be going down. And I don't think that matters whether or not we're talking about the global demand for maple or for spruce or for pine or for eucalyptus or for whatever species a forester is interested in managing. The challenge of the profession, I believe, is to produce more product in the future in the types of quantities and qualities that the consumers are looking for. And at the same time, we've also got this, somewhat competing global demand for more conservation area in the future. Okay, so we've seen international conventions and commitments on setting aside more land for the protection of biodiversity. We've seen this manifest itself into the way of platform commitments for the upcoming federal election. And so if you kind of take both of those factors and put them together, you're left with the concept that silviculture needs to find solutions to grow more product in less area. And that takes investment. So that takes investment either directly in the way of working in the forest with silviculture. It takes investment in things like research institutes like the NHRI that we've seen a lot of the work from this morning. And climate change is adding a big element of uncertainty when it comes to making those financial investments that we need to make. And so my next question to the panel is, what type of strategies do you think that forestry needs to consider in order to provide the assurances that those investors and those investments in long-term silviculture are good investments, and to provide comfort to the investors?
Good question.
I don't have really solutions, more ideas and principles. One thing that strikes me is it's difficult to manage something in an adaptive way if we don't have a clear measure of what's going on the ground. So right now, like Anthony said, we're at the point of assessing what's going on, what are the impacts. And I must admit more of this. Most of the city I see currently going on are projecting in the future. But we also have to monitor what's going on the ground. So, and for the silviculture aspect, two things that are key here is mortality and regeneration. And these two things are generally the less well-studied stuff in our monitoring, day-to-day monitoring, or we're concentrating on growth and yield. But mortality per se, it's part of it, and generally, generation in particular. So it's very hard to adjust our way to do things if we cannot have the clear picture of what's going on. So that's one thing that needs to be fixed, and it's not an easy one. The other one is, I put myself in the boots of somebody that has to make decisions, and how do you make decisions in a very uncertain situation? So one approach is the portfolio. If you want to, we don't know what's going on in the future, one way is to maximize diversity. So maximize, put your money, put your investment in as many baskets you can imagine, and you'll see in the future. On the other side, this approach has some cost. So if there's a very nice opportunity coming in the future, well, you're stuck. You got to put your eggs in many baskets. The other approach is trying to have a prudent portfolio approach, risk-taking, and we're not accustomed to do that in forestry. So we have to develop this methodology right now, with the idea that we want to make robust decisions, meaning that, okay, there's a no regret. Whatever will happen, we'll be able to live with their consequences. So there's one way to do that. For instance, the Shell company, the gas company, they're doing that since many years, many decades, where they have strategic decision to take. They have these very nice set of scenarios for their global scenarios about climate, social climate, economic development, etc., etc. And they're testing their decision to each of these scenarios, and they will keep the ones that are the most acceptable with a bunch of alternative scenarios. That scenario thinking is one probably option we have to explore. So one, maximize diversity is one thing. The other one was, well, let's favor the most adapted species. Well, again, there's a big chunk of uncertainty around that. And the other aspect is sometimes, right now, the pictures we've got from the analysis, projective analysis, is not, well, it's for here, sorry if I make I'll wrap it on shortly, but red maple will be the winner, and boreal species will be the losers in that perspective. So either we're trying to figure out how to build these spruce forests stronger in the future, that's the migration, etc., or another way of thinking that, well, what should we do with red maple? Red maple is not a very desired species for many, so we should think maybe a co-evolution of the value chain with the supply. I'm not advocating that should be the way to go, but that's one of the options we have to take into account.
So we accept the climate's changing, it has changed, and but we're living in today, and for the folks in Nova Scotia that experienced the killing frost in mid-June last year, you're a little bit restricted in the latitude you have for movement. And speaking from the work that has been underway in J.D. Irving, we rely on building resilience in the forest that we manage today as one of the ways to specifically deal with the uncertainty around climate change. And really it kind of boils down to doing the right things in the right places. And the company has been early adopters of technology all along the way, so things like GIS, and more recently since 2010, integrating LiDAR, paying more attention to refining soils maps. We've adopted the depth to water table for many years, and then putting all those things together and building tools to help the on-the-ground folks that are making harvesting prescriptions, making silvicultural decisions, anything from managing hardwood through to what species of conifer to plant on a specific site. So developing internal rules around those things to help basically decision support. So that's a primary strategy to deal with some of the silvicultural risks in the long term. When I look at a good example is mentioned previously about issues around roads and road maintenance associated with washouts and things like that. Well, we've worked with depth of water table mapping from UNB since 2003 and used it basically to minimize the number of crossings, of both streams and wet areas. So basically just prevent the problem from happening right from the get-go. So those are all things, practical things that we look at on the ground that we can do today to build resilience in the forest and the operations.
I guess somewhat connecting what Greg was talking about, well, here in the Maritimes, our forestry sector largely depends on spruce and fir. And spruce and fir are known to be cold adapted species, and as the climate changes, they're likely to become maladapted, less adapted. And when I say adapted, every species has an environmental niche that it's evolved, adapted to, and that's a fancy way of saying every species has evolved to a certain set of environmental conditions under which it does well. And then we know that cold adapted conifers like spruce and fir, they've invested a lot of time and energy over the millennia to investing in biochemical mechanisms within them that allow them and permit them to survive and perform under colder environments. And as the climate warms, it's not that these species might not necessarily be able to survive, but they'll become maladapted and less competitive. And so this is something that's sort of well known and something, of course, to keep in mind. And we're dependent on those species here. But I think one of the biggest things we can do to help ourselves though with that is that the biggest uncertainty is though, what are the specific limits though? How much warming can these species take? And that right now, I would say in the scientific literature is the biggest unknown. We know that they're cold adapted species, we know that warming is likely to occur, and this is going to make them less adapted, but what are the specific limits? If we knew more about that, then we can make more clear projections of how climate may affect these species, which may in turn help in terms of silvicultural decisions and management decisions. So helping to address that uncertainty on what are those specific limits, the climatic limits of these cold adapted species is quite important to the question.
I'm going to take it from the global and then come back to the local and just kind of situate silviculture thinking or forest management thinking in the context of a global carbon budget. If any of you have heard at all about the recent reports out of the United Nations, whether it's the 1.5 degree special report, the land use report, the oceans and cryosphere report, the biodiversity report, all of them speak to the huge gap that's been in our thinking about how to respond to climate change, where we've taken an energy focus, which makes sense since it's 80 to 90% of the source of the problem, but it's not 80 to 90% necessarily of the solution. And integrating agendas around wildlife protection, biodiversity protection, carbon sequestration, working with natural biosystems, restoration, all of that is really hitting a bit of a tipping point in terms of thinking. So let me bring that nationally and explain why that may matter to you, and you might not realize why, and that is that governments are setting greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, and they have the option of direct and indirect options. So they can reduce emissions directly, and they can increase sequestration through enhanced protection and conservation and so on. Canada, like many countries, is short of reaching its target that it set for Paris, but also is short relative to what the science is calling for. Canada's targets will be strengthened, and if you look at the Liberal platform as just one example, I could tell you about it all. I had to analyze them just 2 days ago. But just point out to you that the Liberal platform commits to setting aside 25% of Canada's land base for protection and 25% of its oceans for protection for purposes of not just restoration, but sequestration. The opportunities, I think, could become quite rapid, and the reason for that is the global carbon budget is disappearing quickly. We have very little atmospheric space before we start crossing thresholds. And so the opportunities and the pressures and potentially regulations and legislation and so on are a part of this story. So how might this just affect us here at home? Well, you could see a lot more interest provincially and locally in conservation, restoration, and protection. You could see a lot more interest in opportunities around carbon sequestration and so on. You could see wood first policies, right? So the question then becomes, how do we socially ensure that there's support for these kinds of activities? And I just want to throw out a couple of things to you to think about in terms of how do we work socially around making, essentially reaching some of the goals that Chris talked about. One is in the survey research we do, people engage with their woods and their forests, whether they are woodlot owners or not, in multiple ways. They walk, it's recreation, they love those places, they do maple syrup, they do Christmas trees, they do other products, they collect berries and seeds and so on, they don't just cut wood. And so I think diversity not just in terms of species, but diversity in our values for what we do in the woods is probably part of the story. And then when we ask people what they think is happening in terms of climate change itself, three things come up: wind damage, freeze-thaw cycles, and flooding. And whenever I do interviews or in the surveys when people are asked to comment, they believe that flooding is caused by clear cut. That is a fundamental belief by the vast majority of people that I ever talk to about these issues. If we're going to engage with forests and increase our relationship with them, we've got to engage in an honest conversation and education about what are the factors that affect flooding. Because right now there's like one lens, and I think it's a much more complex story than that, as I know you do too. And so I think there's got to be a lot more conversation about the factors that contribute, including climate change, including land use changes, and agriculture and forestry and so on. So just to throw that out, that the global and the local really do connect. If we want to achieve these goals, we've got to be more flexible and I think open up a diverse range of options for the forest.
Well, in terms of species and what I put my bets on, I'm pretty sure I'd be betting against fir. I haven't seen anybody supporting a fir future. I think the question is really about when impacts on fir are really going to happen. I just want to follow Anthony's discussion on that, on some of these other species, but fir is probably the one that's most, that's probably going to be affected the most. The climate modeling, most of the modeling today is based on these envelope models. So they correlate climate, the range of climate, against the range of species, and suggest that if climate warms to where fir doesn't exist, then we won't have fir anymore. And I guess the question I have is, well, that's assuming that we have a very long period of time for these other species to come in and compete against fir and potentially move fir out of there. It really doesn't capture the management side of it. So what can we do as managers to promote fir, and you know, how does that interact with this idea that we're going to lose fir? So at some point we're going to lose fir, that's for sure. But what effect can management have in terms of prolonging that decline is kind of the question I have. And working with Anthony, and we've compiled permanent sample plots from Florida all the way up through Ontario, up to Newfoundland, and we're trying to better understand and better calibrate these models to understand, okay, what is the real growth expectation and survival expectation and regeneration expectation of fir under these different climates, so that we can have a better understanding of how our management would affect fir and climate is going to affect fir. So give us a better idea of what that window of risk is going to look like down the road. The other aspect that I'm interested in is genetics, and we know that there's some plasticity in genetics of all of these species. So we're interested in understanding the plasticity of our local populations and then populations down south that could possibly be moved north. Even if we conclude that fir does well in North Carolina and they can grow Christmas trees there if they manage them that way, it may be that is a very different genotype than what we have here. And that variety of balsam fir just does not, we don't have it. So they're still going to be impacted quite a bit. And we've been trying to set up trials where we take some of our seed stock and send it down to New York and North Carolina, and we've been trying to get that project off the ground for a number of years. So hopefully we'll see that, and we'll be able to explore that plasticity of genetics, and we'll be able to put those two information sources together and come up with more reasonable estimates of the timing of the impact on fir and spruce. So.
Yes, from a landscape perspective, when we talk about climate change, typically we think that all of New Brunswick will be more or less affected the same way. Yes, but you have to remember elevations do vary. So higher elevation areas can act as a refuge for some time for some of these species. For example, northwest side of Brunswick, the temperatures right now are typically cooler, and of course they'll increase, but the changes that are expected in that higher elevation part will be different than what you would expect in terms of the low-lying areas in New Brunswick. So I think, and I agree with Greg's comment, that it becomes very location specific. So in terms of north-facing versus south-facing, you're dealing with two different animals in terms of the microsites involved. And so I think we need to approach this problem from a very location-specific point of view, because even though the temperatures are increasing, it's really the absolute values of these values in terms of as you go from high elevation to low elevation. So there is some room. It's not going to occur across New Brunswick as one event where everything, in terms of balsam fir, for example, everything disappears. It's not going to be the case. There will be some parts of the province that will act as a location where the fir can persist for a while. Once that upper area, northwest New Brunswick, for example, if it gets too warm and you reach that threshold, again, there's arguments about what those thresholds are, but once it reaches that threshold, it's possible that eventually it gets eliminated from the landscape. Just as an extension from what I was saying when I went through the Cambrian Highlands, now what they're seeing is that the plateau is viewed as a boreal forest classification. Now the temperate forests, which tends to be in the valleys, are starting to move into the plateau. So there is some movement occurring, and but again, it's a situation of where it is, so position is very important, especially from a landscape perspective, to really dealing at the very fine scales. Somewhat what Chris talked about earlier, 20 meters is probably at a level, an ecosite level, is probably something that needs to be brought forward for people managing.
Okay, and Charles, you just keep that mic because I'm going to give you the first turn this time around for this round of questions to be fair to everybody. My last pre-prepared question reflects the fact that I think many of the people in the room and Canadian Woodlands Forum members are, the folks, the professionals who are really tasked on a day-to-day basis with designing and implementing silviculture prescriptions that are going to create the future forest. And I think in order to provide value as a panel to that audience, we don't want to leave you with anxiety, because that's a terrible thing to leave with after one of these big climate change discussions. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Can you offer, I would just say one or two simple pieces of advice that the folks who are on a day-to-day basis designing and executing silviculture prescriptions on the landscape, what should they be thinking about in order to kind of leave the day happy, knowing that they've considered climate change in a way that's meaningful?
Well, I'll start as a doomsayer. The climate system is very non-linear, and so there can be lots of variability, as we talked about before. But I think as an extension of what I talked about earlier, I think you really need to look at the level and how climate change actually influences individual sites. So I think we need to go to that level to make, to have something to say about what is the possible prescriptions that you might specify. And most of you are already doing that, right? And if you're managing the forest, you're already doing that. You have a sort of appreciation already about how things vary. And with climate change, there's going to be another layer that you'll need to consider, but the changes that you expect in terms of the different sites, you'll need to consider the fact that those will change as well. But that's at the level that you need to start thinking about in terms of everyday type of activity. That's all I can think of.
To a certain extent, that question revolves around the landowner's values and what they want out of the land. So I'll speak from my perspective as maybe a private woodlot owner. If I was to manage a private woodlot, a small woodlot, I guess I'd be trying to move that landscape into both a flexible position, so maintaining a large number of different tree species, and probably weeding out fir as much as I can. I don't know if that's any different than our past management for spruce bugworm, but certainly I'd be looking at maybe moving in more oak, at least southern New Brunswick. I think planting oak and protecting that oak from deer browse might be a strategy. And trying to promote quality, I think, as well. So if red maple is supposed to do quite well, then maybe we can manage for red maple and really manage quality. So those coppice trees that are coming up in clumps, thinning those down and trying to produce a decent saw log out of that. So.
I think because I'm not the forest expert, but I'll come at it more from a management point of view, and it's stimulated by the ride down with Charles today, and we were reading the questions that Chris had sent us, and this question started with, silviculture will continue to intensify in the future. And I automatically said, why? And I raised that because one of the things I found over the decades of working on this issue is that we are operating in a situation of high uncertainty. And a rigidity is going to break us. And we need to be highly flexible. And so the one thing I just wanted to kind of maybe put out as a management kind of thought that I've learned in this issue is that we all come to the table with status quo bias. And I strongly encourage folks to think about what their status quo biases are. And to develop scenarios and actually expose yourself to people who are going to challenge you. The challengers are often called the advocates, but those of us who defend the status quo are just as much advocating for something as the status quo as people who are advocating for change. So bias is present everywhere in all of us, and we need to acknowledge that and not be othering people in this process. And so your rebels and your challengers are probably your best friends in some of this work, to challenge you to think beyond what you might be thinking of currently. And so, it's a critical thinking process, and scenario development is really important. Can I look at, multiple outcomes here, no matter which way this thing goes, I'm still going to get a good result, right? That's what you really want to do, and I think that's what Chris is talking about, Charles, and others. But I wanted to just put that out there. I'm asking questions all day long. Two-age structure? Why? Let why be your best friend when you're thinking about climate change.
Thanks, Louise. Well, I guess I wanted to preface my response with, well, we know the climate is going to change. It's very likely that we'll see 2 degrees warming within the next 30 years here in New Brunswick. So that's something really important to take in consideration. We also know, and I think it's very well known, that spruce and fir are cold-adapted species. And so they're likely to become more and more maladapted, less adapted to the climate as it warms. However, it's still very uncertain. What are the limits of spruce and fir? How much warming can they take before that's it? You know what I mean? So they may become maladapted, but we don't know where that limit is. So with that in mind, I guess my response would be, if your bread and butter is growing spruce and fir, and when we think about the potential climate change, or that climate change over the next 30 years, then things like pre-commercial thinning, where you control for competition, I think are one of your best options. I don't think the climate's going to change in such a way that you're not going to be able to grow spruce and fir in the next 30 years. But I do think over the next 30 to 50 years, other warmer adapted species may become more competitive, and spruce and fir might have a tougher time. So if you really need spruce and fir, then you're going to have to control for competition. Another important aspect to bring up is to think more and more about genotype-assisted migration. If you want to keep spruce and fir, then are there genotypes within the species that are perhaps we should be planting more of those as opposed to relying on the northern ones? So those are things to think about if your bread and butter is spruce and fir. Otherwise, I guess the classic answer is to maintain biodiversity. And just like you would do with your finances and your financial portfolio. Because there's so many unknowns, maintaining a diverse forest where you can is probably one of your best coveralls for now. So those are my 2 answers.
So I think my answers are really supported by some of the approaches that have been brought forward. And really, I guess the first specific thing I would say is building on decision support systems to help people make better choices that identify changes across the landscape that Charles would indicate, So, you know, a range of things to help you make better decisions today is likely gonna, it's not a guarantee that your forest is gonna be well adapted, but it's a good start. Stand tending, it's mentioned in the video that we saw, and I think, again, related to resilience, tending stands to allow healthy crowns and those sorts of things that typically make the trees more resilient, whether it's to wind throw or whether it's to defoliation or any of these things. It's generally helpful if you've got trees that have been tended and are free to grow. The other, so as well as building resilience, that will also result in a shorter risk period for that silviculture investment you make. So we know all the time that you're gonna produce a saw log a lot faster if the stand's been tended, which will reduce the exposure period. You know, the time frames we talk about, we can't be thinking about the climate 100 years from now. It's going to be a gradual process, and you're going to have to constantly adapt over that time frame. So if you can reduce the time frame that your silviculture investment is exposed to, then that's a positive thing. The other thing about stand tending is it will typically improve the ratio of solid wood products compared to other products, and that will have a big impact on the carbon balance sheet. So that's another approach. There's been some talk about genetics, and that's an area that I've spent a lot of time at. And you know, for the last 40 years in this region, there's been genetic tree improvement programs ongoing right now for 6 different conifer species. And those have deliberately tested across a broad climate gradient. So if you think about something like frost-free days, we're testing from 90 to 100 frost-free days in northern Brunswick, right through to 150 to 170 frost-free days in parts of Nova Scotia. So we're already testing today across a climate gradient that's probably, I'd have to defer to Charles or Anthony about that, but probably as large as what would be predicted in the next 30 or 40 years. So you know, that tree improvement investment that folks have made over the last 40 years is a very sound thing for working with adaptation. And there's enormous genetic variability in our populations. And at the same time, it makes a lot of sense to start to integrate sources from further away as an additional source of variation that we can use over time. So that's another important approach. The big issue is when we start talking about hardwoods and mixed wood, where there's basically a 100% reliance on natural regeneration, and the work that's done today to sort of build resilience in those forest types is mostly related to influencing species composition, and you know, that's certainly a value to a certain extent, but for changes over time, really thinking hard about hardwood and mixed wood, that's going to take some really innovative work and intensive and expensive work to integrate likely silviculture systems that we don't even know about today. So it will be a challenge, but it's a big chunk of our forest and will require attention.
Yeah, I will reinforce the thing that has been said already. I like to think, if I'm asked, well, John, what should we do right now about our silviculture? With all the unknown, I would say, well, 3 things based on science. First, I like looking at the current forest, the future forest, and future forest. So the current forest is the thing that is documented in some areas that thinning increases drought resistance. So if you're expecting drought, it's not necessarily the case. It depends on the areas, but thinning trees increases the drought resistance. So on the short term, there's a risk reducing thing. The second thing is, that's the short term. The midterm would be for working for the preparing the next forest is favor development of advanced growth early in the stand development. I'm biased toward mixed wood and hardwoods, that's where I'm working with. But definitely these, if we promote advanced regeneration, that means that if we've got any event that comes in, the resilience, the coming back of the stand will be earlier and in a more desired state than if we just let the nature goes. So that's one precaution, and that goes towards the proposition that Ketan gave about probably sitting in the middle ground between even age and uneven age. So two-stage or irrigator shuttle with that kind of stuff. And the last one would be for longer term. Right now, it's keep species diversity high, and in silviculture that means have a diversity of size of openings. So if we know that if we're making very small gaps, we'll end up with maple, we'll end up with beech, but other species that are probably more tolerant to drought need greater openings. So barring these openings, that's an easy way to get this species diversity with species in the ground right now. I'm not talking about right now assisted migration. That's part of the portfolio, but it's still on the research side. The last one would be right now. Stay tuned for new science and be prepared to change, because right now we're talking in proposition. Nothing has been tested right now. And we need to develop those new technologies, and we're on the edge right now doing that. So hopefully results and proposition will evolve quickly over the last decade. So our words right now are just the beginning of it.
Excellent. So at this point, we're going to open up the panel to take questions from the floor. By now, you should have all got lots of things going in the back of your mind that you want to ask. So the only ground rules are that if you want to ask a question, just please raise your hand, and I'm going to run over to you and give you the microphone. And there's a microphone here that's going to stay with the panelists. And please indicate who you're asking the question to. If it's a question for the entire panel, or if it's something that you're looking for one or two specific members to chime in. So who wants to go first? Okay, right at the back of the room. Thanks for that.
Hi, Chris.
Chris Lee, Canadian Association of Forest Owners. Thanks for the opportunity. This is for all of you to think about. Louise mentioned the notion of protected areas, the Liberal platform, 25% of the terrestrial land base protected. In British Columbia, there were big chunks of land set aside for a whole bunch of values: old growth, biodiversity, psychological, I think, was a big part of it. A lot of those have been lost to fire and insects. So I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about this notion of protected as one of the tools to address climate change.
Whoever wants to go first. You have a microphone out there, so.
I think part of this is developing a new relationship. I actually have difficulty with the concept of protected because it's like out there instead of everywhere. And I think part of what's required when you look at the scale of let's just call it restoration that's required. We're talking greening urban environments, we're talking everything. Yes, there will be obviously impacts from climate change itself and other human interventions, but the reality is that we've got a massive shift that's required in terms of how we're relating to nature and how we're relating to whether you want to call it conservation or protection. I call it caring more than anything else. We know, for example, that the mental health effects of being in nature are enormous. We know that nature experiences are the #1 reason people engage in environmental protection. there's decades of research on this. So it's about protection, but I wouldn't call it walling it off, right? It's about engaging and relating and being in nature. And so, we're going to have to take our hits. Not everything can be protected. I actually think when you think about the East Coast, I don't, yes, fire maybe will be more than we've had before, but not like it's going to be out west, right? We have opportunities here that may not be the kind of opportunities you would have anywhere. We have people who are skilled. We still have people who relate to the land. I mean, I just see an enormous opportunity for us to engage in a whole new way with our forests that is part of this story of restoring, which is a very different concept than protecting and setting apart.
Other panelists want to weigh in? Okay, Chris, I think were there any other panelists that wanted to weigh in on Chris's question? Otherwise, I think you've stumped. Next question from the audience.
Steve Tudor with Columbia Forest Products. And with such a professional panel and such a great meeting of forest people, will this shorten our rotations? So that's the real question. I mean, if we're talking about a hybrid species, red maple, and or do you feel, the panel, that it's possible to put more diameter on every year with a changing climate, such as we'll be growing trees like Connecticut, and Connecticut may be growing bananas?
I have the mic, so I'll start. Whether or not the climate change that's expected will shorten rotation times, and I assume in doing so you mean by like enhancing growth.
Yes.
I guess, yeah. I can't say, to be honest, whether or not, like, there's obviously the change in climate, the change in temperature, the change in precipitation is going to affect growth somehow. But the work I'm doing right now, and I hate always saying it's uncertain, but it's still not clear, like, with 2 degrees of warming, will that enhance the growth of spruce and fir that's here right now, or decrease that, or have no sort of an insignificant effect? And so, because of that uncertainty, I can't really say in conscience, in the next 30 years, we're going to have shorter rotations of forests based on the change in climate that we're expecting. That's my answer.
I asked the same questions. The answer I've got is, please correct me if I'm wrong, like the projection for temperature are pretty good. Projection for precipitation, so the big question, will we have drought problem or not? So that's the question we have to answer here. If we've got water and we've got temperature, well, it's treat. Maybe I'm oversimplifying the problem, but what I'm hearing, where I'm questioning people about working on climate projections, there seems to be a higher uncertainty about precipitation, and that's what concerns me. Am I on the wrong place? I'm with that wrong. The right guys here to say yes or no.
I'll start by saying that there probably is going to be some upside. We might even be experiencing some upside right now, compared to, say, the 1980s. But I know Werner Kurtz, a leading carbon accounting expert in Canada, the Victoria Canadian Forest Service. They did a study, I think, 10 or 15 years ago now, when we were thinking about whether or not forest management was going to be included in carbon accounting nationally. And the question was raised about whether or not the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere and increased temperatures would result in an increased productivity of our forests. What they concluded was that the amount of disturbances, because they're expected to increase, and this is probably more so for Western Canada, with respect to fires and mountain pine beetle, they would trump any increase in growth that we would experience from increase in temperatures, and the disturbances would trump that growth. So just a different perspective on that from a national authority with carbon count. But I would anticipate that there would be some upside there. It's just a matter of whether or not this drought impact is going to have an effect, whether or not we're going to experience 2 to 3 weeks of severe drought, and these trees are going to shut down.
Yeah, on that issue, we talk a lot about drought, but there's also the other side of the spectrum, and that's overweight. So if you look at the landscape, it becomes an issue of where you are in the landscape here. So if you are essentially at the bottom of the valley, it's potential that given the projections of rainfall is upward, and if you do the, using very simple hydrological models, there's an indication that the soils would get, on average, wetter. There's always the possibility of drought. There's always the possibility of loss of water. It depends on the conditions, but just think in terms of where water goes. It doesn't stay in one location. It moves around based on the topography itself. So it's possible with the wetting, especially the depressions of the landscape, you might get actually a reduction of growth as well. In terms of CO2, there's always this thing about saturation. Trees can take up some, probably more CO2, but it can be to a level where the concentrations are so high that the amount of uptake is actually at a point of saturation, and therefore the growth will stop to increase as you would like to see. Yeah, so there's, again, based on what Anthony says, there's so many factors involved, and they work together or they work against each other. And what that is very difficult to say. And so just to give you some examples, that's,
Thank you.
yeah.
Okay. Greg, did you want to get in on that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, these folks know more about the drought and CO2 concentrations, but I think probably the most significant thing is how we react to climate change and what's the level of forest management activities and silviculture that goes on that will have the bigger effect on rotation length.
Can I just add one thing, Chris? Sorry about that, but I just think it's important to mention that, drought may come into play. It's projected that temperature is projected to increase, but the level of precipitation doesn't match the change in temperature. So increases in dry spells is something to consider. The thing with the CO2 effect, there's no legitimate studies yet to show a fertilization effect on the forest anywhere in the world. And when we talk about fertilization, typically in a greenhouse setting, you have up to 1,000 parts per million to really evoke a response. We're talking about changing from currently 400 parts per million to maybe 425 parts per million over the next 20, 30 years. So I don't think the CO2 fertilization thing will really come into play myself. And the other last thing just to mention is that regardless if a plant has moisture, there is a thermal limit. A plant can have all the water in the world, but if you keep increasing the temperature, some plants conk out. The machinery inside the leaves just doesn't operate at those temperatures. And so that's an important thing to consider as well.
Okay, we have time for another question from the audience. Michelle.
Thanks. I'm Michel Soucy with the University of Moncton. My question is directed more towards Louise. I'd just like to know your point of view with regards to which direction the social license is going in the Maritimes. People are getting sensible to climate change, but are we losing the battle with regards to forest management being part of the solution, or do you feel that the social license, that there's gaining acceptability of the forest being part of that solution?
I think we need more open, honest conversations and to engage people. I actually think the battle's being lost. I do some work with the Conservation Council in Brunswick, and they've never had such a strong response. I mean, in terms of, you've seen the petition activity and so on. I do think there's room for getting to know each other, right? And more communication, more information exchange. I think what happens is, when we hear from people whose opinion is strong and we disagree with that opinion, our first reaction is to dismiss it, right? But just as a person who might not be fully on board with climate change as an issue, they have their issues that you can identify what's driving them. There's a motivation there. And other people are also who think that it's whether it's clear cutting or other aspects of forestry. Glyphosate spraying is coming up all the time. They are motivated as well by something important, right, that needs to be acknowledged and recognized. And so I think for me, the value and the opportunity, because I think forests and forestry have a bigger role to play in the province, that we need to build a more positive relationship, and how you go about doing that and how we all go about doing that, well, it's worth exploring, but I think the commitment has to be made.
Do I see any other hands from the audience?
Yeah, over here, Chris, right here. I just have a question. Person has it, like them first.
Hi, Rosanna with the Canadian Forest Service. Quick question, is there a gap in research that you guys think for like climate change and in particular the working forests? Is there somewhere that needs to be filled?
I guess I'll start. I don't know. When I hear that question, I just think of all of the gaps. There's some. From what we've talked about, I think we've identified a number of those gaps, and it's almost overwhelming how much we don't understand about what's going to happen. So, but at the end of the day, we're forced to make these predictions about how the forest is going to change over time through our management. So we'll have to make some tough calls. I think focus on, and at least from my perspective, the main gap is just understanding how growth and survival and regeneration is going to change. And I think if you can get that gap filled, even with our best guess of how it's going to change, that will lead into choosing better silviculture options for that working forest.
I think there's a couple of things. Applied silviculture is I think there's more work needed there. There will be new situations that require different approaches, and that's an area of expertise that's going to need to develop. Concerns around adaptive variation patterns of species. There's been tree improvement programs across the country for a bunch of different species, and some of them stronger than others. But as well as just providing faster growing planting stock, there's going to be a more significant role from an adaptation standpoint, and that's something that will likely need to be enhanced over time.
I have one. And it may be happening and I just haven't seen it yet, but it has not come up in my policy work. I have real concerns about the stacking effects of federal policy on forest management. So we have, three things just right off the bat. We've got carbon pricing, we've got clean fuel standard, and we've got carbon offsets policies, all potentially competing for space in the forest, if you will, alongside forest timber products and so on. And it's not clear to me that people are actually looking at how all of those policies being implemented at the same time potentially affect how we relate to the forest. And then we've got conservation on top of that. So think of the competition that we're putting onto the table here that goes on top of everything else that you're doing. Clean fuel standard is a standard to reduce the the greenhouse gas intensity of liquid and solid fuels. A potential opportunity for bioenergy, as an example. We've got carbon pricing, meaning that people are looking for carbon offsets, whether it's because of the industrial regulations, which I presume decline over time. And we've got carbon sequestration that we want for conservation purposes and forest products. So that would be an area that I would really welcome federal analysis about the effect of their own policies on competition in the forest.
Okay, I think we've got time for potentially one final audience question. I see a hand over there, so you've got it.
So we're talking about growth and yield and forest even in microsites, but have you guys thought anything about at even a smaller scale? So when we have these premature springs, buds start opening, we get a cold snap, how's that going to start affecting form of the trees, and is there a way to mitigate that?
So are you referring to sort of the thaw during the wintertime?
Yeah.
That's going to be a significant impact. What we see, I did a study back in 2005, and what we see, we can actually track those types of events from the 1930s up to the last big one was in Quebec, where the sugar maple industry was decimated. And really, it relates to a significant increase in temperature during that winter period, and where then the temperatures drop, causing cavitation to occur in the trees, and potentially, causing dieback. The level of dieback depends, of course, on the level of cavitation, and the expectation is that those, given that the warming of the winters is happening, you can expect more of that to be occurring.
What about for species in New Brunswick, so you get fir or spruce?
Yeah, typically we're talking about the forest species like yellow birch and the birches, and certainly can happen in the balsam fir as well. But I didn't look at those specifically. I looked at two birches, and typically you can pick it up simply by looking at the weather data and how it varies over the winter period. So again, the expectation is that a number of thaws and the duration will be increasing.
Any of our other panelists looking to get in on that?
Just I guess to reiterate some of what Charles was saying is that as the climate changes, yes, it's not just a simple matter of mean annual temperature changing. The climate's a very complex thing, and so earlier springs, later frost, those are things that may change as well. Winter thaws, like those are the types of behaviors or phenomena that are associated with changes in climate that are really nuanced and complex, and trying to understand how all those things, like earlier bud burst, and how that affects a species, and how it affects a species relative to other species. Those are parts of the, parts of the question. So.
Okay, so before we draw this session to a close, I just want all of you to join me in thanking the 7 panelists who I think have done a tremendous job of thinking on the fly and really producing an interesting set of answers to the questions that we've posed you today. Before I ask that everybody join me in giving you a round of applause, I just want to remind the crowd that Canadian Woodlands Forum has put together in the way of a speaker's appreciation token, a generous donation to the Log Roll program for kids, which is going to support children's hospitals in the area. And so please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause.